The night my husband went to his brother's engagement party without me, his mother told him it was family only. She said it casually, like it was obvious, like I didn't count. By the next morning, her country club membership was revoked. Her charity board asked her to step down, and my father-in-law's private golf club quietly canceled their membership. That was the moment they stopped asking what happened and started asking who I really was. My name is Audrey Hale, and until that night, I was very careful about staying invisible. I'm 35 years old. I've been married to Daniel Hale for 4 years. Daniel is kind, thoughtful, and deeply loyal to his family, sometimes to his own detriment. He grew up believing that keeping the peace mattered more than telling the truth. I grew up learning that silence is powerful, but only when it's chosen. Daniel's family has always been particular. His mother, Margaret Hale, lives for hierarchy. Invitations are currency to her. Seating charts are power maps. She believes respect is something you earn by fitting in, not something you deserve by showing up. Margaret runs on appearances, country clubs, charity luncheons, boards with titles that sound important even when no real work gets done. His father, Richard Hale, follows wherever Margaret leads. He likes to golf, shake hands, and pretend he doesn't notice how his wife controls every room she enters. Together, they've built a world where everyone knows their place, and no one questions who decides it. Then there's Evan Hale, Daniel's younger brother, the golden child, the one whose engagement was being celebrated that night. Evan has never been told no, never been excluded, never had to wonder if he belonged. His fiancée, Lila Warren, is sweet, polite, and quiet. The kind of woman who senses tension but doesn't challenge it. I don't blame her for what happened, but she didn't stop it either. And then there was me, the wife who didn't get an invitation. I didn't hear about the engagement party directly. I found out the way women like me always do, through silence that feels louder than words. A group text that didn't include my name, a passing comment about the venue, Daniel pausing just a second too long when I asked what time we were leaving. I remember standing in our bedroom that evening, watching Daniel button his shirt. He looked uncomfortable, like a man trying to convince himself that discomfort meant compromise, not betrayal. I asked him calmly, "What did your mom say about me?" He didn't answer right away. That hesitation told me everything. She said it was family only, he finally said. Just this once. Just this once. As if exclusion is ever temporary, as if disrespect doesn't echo. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't cry, I didn't beg him not to go. I nodded, smoothed the front of his jacket, and handed him his watch. I told him to have a good time. I even smiled. Margaret thought that meant she'd won. What she didn't know was that I had spent years choosing when to speak and when to listen. She didn't know that my silence wasn't submission. It was restraint. As Daniel walked out the door, I stood alone in our quiet house, surrounded by the life I had built carefully and intentionally. I didn't feel angry. I felt clear. Clear about who I was to them. Clear about what they thought I was worth. And very clear about what I was no longer willing to accept. They thought this story was about an engagement party. They thought it was about seating and family labels. They had no idea it was about to become something much bigger. Because while Margaret Hale was clinking champagne glasses and smiling for photos, I was sitting down at my dining table, opening my contact list, and deciding that if they wanted to treat me like I didn't exist, I would show them exactly what happens when the wrong person is underestimated. And by morning, everything they valued would begin to disappear. Before that night, my life with Daniel was steady. Not perfect, but grounded. We met in our early 30s, long past the age of reckless choices and dramatic romances. Daniel wasn't flashy. He was thoughtful, consistent, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke. That was what drew me to him. We married quietly. No extravagant ballroom, no donor lists or social climbing, just family, close friends, and a promise that felt private and real. Margaret never forgave me for that. She wanted a spectacle. A wedding that announced her success, not our love. From the beginning, I sensed that I didn't fit the shape she had imagined for her son's wife. I was polite, but I didn't perform. I dressed simply. I asked questions instead of making statements. I observed rooms instead of trying to control them. Margaret noticed all of it. She'd say things like, Audrey is very self-contained, with a tight smile, as if it were a flaw. Or, you're so independent, the way some people say difficult. At first, I tried to meet her halfway. I brought wine to dinners. I volunteered at events. I smiled through conversations where I was spoken over, corrected, or subtly dismissed. Daniel noticed, but he didn't always understand. He grew up believing his mother's behavior was normal, that her constant evaluations were just her way of caring. When I pointed out how often she excluded me from decisions that involved my own marriage, he'd sigh and say, "That's just how she is." I learned quickly that "that's just how she is" often means, "this is how she's always been allowed to behave." The truth is, Margaret didn't dislike me. She disliked that she couldn't place me. I didn't ask for her approval. I didn't compete for attention. I didn't try to prove my worth in rooms where worth was measured by last names and donor plaques. That made her uneasy. Family gatherings became exercises in restraint. I watched Margaret orchestrate conversations, seating and alliances like a chessboard. She'd introduce people with embellished titles and skim past me as if I were an afterthought. "This is Audrey," she'd say, nothing more. No mention of my work, no curiosity about my background. Once, during Thanksgiving, she leaned over and whispered, "You're very private, aren't you?" I smiled and said, "I value clarity." She didn't like that answer. Daniel, for his part, tried to bridge the gap. He'd squeeze my hand under the table when his mother made a cutting remark. He'd apologize later, quietly, in the car. "She didn't mean it like that," he'd say. "She's just old-fashioned." But old-fashioned doesn't explain exclusion. Control does. By the time Evan announced his engagement, I had already learned how Margaret operated. The engagement party wasn't just a celebration, it was a message, a declaration of who belonged and who didn't, who was permanent and who was provisional. Still, I didn't expect to be cut out entirely. I was Daniel's wife, not a girlfriend, not a guest. Family. That's what made it sting. Not the party itself, but the clarity of the insult. Margaret didn't forget me. She chose not to include me, and she did it through Daniel, knowing he would struggle to say no. The night before the party, Daniel sat beside me on the couch, nervous. "It's just one night," he said. "I don't want this to turn into a bigger thing." I looked at him and realized something painful. To Margaret, I was a variable. To Daniel, I was a compromise. And to myself, I had been patient for too long. I told him calmly, "Go, I'll be fine." And I meant it. Not because it didn't hurt, but because I had finally stopped hoping they would treat me better on their own. That night didn't begin with anger. It began with acceptance. And acceptance, for someone like me, is often the most dangerous place to start. By the afternoon of the engagement party, it was no longer just a misunderstanding. It was undeniable. I stood in our kitchen scrolling through my phone, watching plans unfold in real time. Photos of flower arrangements, a message about valet parking, someone asking whether the band would arrive before or after sunset. All of it happening in a family group chat I wasn't part of, forwarded to Daniel secondhand like an afterthought. I didn't ask to be added. I already knew the answer. When Daniel came home early to change, I asked him one more time, directly, if there had been any confusion, if perhaps the invitation had been lost or forgotten. I gave him an opening. He closed it without meaning to. "She was very clear," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Mom said it's better this way." Better for who was the unspoken question. I asked him to sit down with me at the dining table, the same table where we planned vacations, discussed finances, and talked about our future. I wanted him, grounded when we had this conversation. "Daniel," I said, keeping my voice steady, "your mother is hosting a celebration for your brother. You are married. I am your family. Explain to me why I'm being excluded." He looked down at the wood grain, as if the answer might be written there. "She thinks it will be uncomfortable if you're there." "Uncomfortable for who?" He hesitated. "For her." There it was. Not a logistical issue, not tradition, discomfort. My presence disrupted the hierarchy she was trying to maintain. I asked if Evan or Lila had said anything. Daniel shook his head. "They're just going along with it." Going along with it. That phrase landed harder than I expected. It meant everyone had noticed. Everyone had decided silence was easier than decency. I thought about the dinners where I'd been seated at the far end of the table, the charity events where my name was left off programs, the holidays where decisions were made without my input. This wasn't new. It was just finally visible. "Are you still going?" I asked. Daniel exhaled slowly. "If I don't, she'll make this a bigger issue." I almost laughed. She already had. I stood up and walked into our bedroom, not to escape, but to think. I watched Daniel choose his jacket, the one his mother bought him. I noticed how careful he was, like a child trying not to disappoint. That was when it stopped being about Margaret alone. It became about Daniel's inability to draw a line, his fear of confrontation, his belief that keeping peace required my absence. I returned to the room and helped him straighten his collar. I could feel his tension under my fingers. "You don't have to defend me tonight," I told him, "but understand this. Every time you let her erase me, you teach her it's allowed." He nodded, but he didn't argue. That was almost worse. Margaret called him as he was leaving. I could hear her voice through the phone, sharp and cheerful at the same time. "You're on your way, right?" she asked. Then lower, "Good. This is family business." Daniel glanced at me, guilt written across his face. He said nothing. The door closed behind him, and the house went quiet. Not peaceful, intent. I didn't cry. I didn't pace. I sat at the table and thought about every time I had been patient, every time I had chosen grace over clarity. I realized something important in that silence. Margaret didn't fear my anger. She feared my presence, and that meant she sensed something she couldn't control. That realization shifted everything. I opened my laptop and pulled up notes I hadn't looked at in years, contacts I rarely used socially. People who knew me in contexts Margaret never bothered to ask about. I wasn't reaching for weapons. I was reaching for truth. Before making a single call, I asked myself one question. If I do nothing tonight, will this ever change? I already knew the answer. The conflict wasn't just about an invitation. It was about whether my marriage would always require me to shrink, whether respect would always be conditional, whether silence would continue to be mistaken for weakness. By the time the party began, champagne was flowing, speeches were being rehearsed, and Margaret was smiling for photos, and I was finally done waiting for permission to exist in my own life. Once the front door closed behind Daniel, the house felt different. Not lonely, clear, the kind of quiet that sharpens your thoughts instead of drowning them. I didn't rush. I didn't act on impulse. I poured myself a glass of water, not wine, and sat at the dining table where Daniel and I had just talked. I wanted my mind steady. This wasn't about revenge. It was about correction. I opened my phone and scrolled past contacts I used every day. Friends, colleagues, people who knew me as Audrey, the wife, the polite presence at dinners. I kept going until I reached names that belonged to another part of my life, a quieter part, one Margaret never bothered to ask about. I thought briefly about my grandfather, Thomas Whitaker. He used to tell me that power doesn't announce itself. It waits. He spent decades investigating ethics violations for institutions that believed their reputations made them untouchable. He taught me that organizations don't fall because of enemies. They fall because of patterns someone finally documents. My mother, Elaine Whitaker, taught me something just as important. That accountability doesn't require shouting. It requires precision. I wasn't about to make threats. I wasn't going to demand apologies. I was simply going to ask questions. The right questions to the right people. The first call was to Marianne Lewis, a woman I had worked with years ago while consulting for donor compliance. She sat on the membership review committee at Margaret's Country Club. I hadn't spoken to her socially in a long time, but professionally, we were on solid ground. She answered on the second ring. "Audrey," she said, surprised but warm, "this is unexpected." "I'll be brief," I told her. "I'm calling in a professional capacity." That was all it took for her tone to shift. I explained calmly that I had reason to believe a current member was using club-hosted events to exclude immediate family while leveraging the club's name to maintain social standing and solicit donations. I didn't give names at first. I asked if that aligned with their membership guidelines. There was a pause. Then Marianne said, "That would be a concern." Only then did I say Margaret Hale's name. I can't discuss outcomes, Marianne said carefully, but I appreciate you bringing this to our attention. I thanked her and hung up. The second call was to Dr. Susan Patel, who chaired the ethics committee of a regional charity board Margaret proudly served on. Susan knew me not as a spouse or a social acquaintance, but as someone who helped institutions avoid scandals they never saw coming. I framed the conversation the same way. No emotion, no accusation, just facts, patterns, optics. Are you suggesting misuse of affiliation? Susan asked. I'm suggesting a review, I replied. She was quiet for a moment. We'll handle it. By the time I made the third call, my hands were steady. I contacted Edward Klein, an external advisor for private clubs, someone my grandfather had once mentored. I didn't even need to explain much. He already knew the Hales by reputation. Interesting timing, he said when I mentioned the family name. We've had questions before. That was the moment I knew this wasn't about one night. This had been waiting to surface. I didn't call Evan. I didn't call Lila. I didn't call Margaret. This wasn't personal. It was structural. You don't confront people like Margaret directly. You let the systems they rely on do the talking. After the calls, I closed my laptop and turned off my phone. That part mattered. I wasn't waiting for responses. I wasn't watching for reactions. I had done what I needed to do. I went upstairs, changed into comfortable clothes, and washed my face. I looked at my reflection and felt something unfamiliar. Not triumph, not anger, relief. For the first time since marrying into the Hale family, I hadn't adjusted myself to fit their expectations. I hadn't softened my presence. I hadn't stayed quiet to keep things smooth. I went to bed early, slept deeply. While champagne glasses clinked and speeches were made, reviews were being flagged, emails were being drafted, meetings were being scheduled for Monday morning. Margaret was smiling for photos, unaware that the very institutions she used to measure her worth were quietly reassessing whether she belonged. I didn't need to witness the fallout to know it was coming. All I had done was stop protecting a system that never protected me, and once that decision was made, everything else became inevitable. I woke up the next morning to my phone vibrating on the nightstand, not ringing, buzzing, over and over again, like something was trying to get my attention without quite knowing how. For a moment, I didn't reach for it. I already knew. When I finally picked it up, there were 12 missed calls, 10 from Daniel, 2 from an unknown number I recognized immediately as Margaret's. She only called directly when control was slipping. I sat up, calm, and answered Daniel first. "What happened?" he asked, his voice tight and breathless. "I'm not sure," I said honestly. "Tell me what you know." There was noise in the background, the sound of panic trying to stay contained. My mom's country club called her this morning. They said her membership was being revoked, effective immediately. Something about a review and conduct concerns. Then the charity board emailed her. They asked her to step down pending an ethics evaluation. He stopped, talking for a second, as if waiting for the world to correct itself. "And my dad," he continued, "his golf club canceled their membership. No explanation, just done." I let the silence sit. "She thinks it's you," he said quietly. "Do you?" I asked. Another pause, this one longer. "I don't know what to think," he admitted. Before he could say more, the unknown number called again. This time, I answered. "Audrey," Margaret said. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "What did you do?" I didn't match her volume. I never did. "I made a few calls," I said, "the same way you made a few decisions." Her breath caught. "You had no right." "I had every right," I replied. "You excluded me from your family and leveraged institutions that depend on integrity. I didn't lie. I didn't exaggerate. I asked questions." She raised her voice. "You embarrassed us." "No," I corrected her. "Your behavior did." She showed up at our house less than an hour later. No announcement, no smile, just urgency. Richard followed behind her, pale and quiet, the way men get when the rules they relied on suddenly change. Margaret didn't sit. She stood in the middle of our living room like she was still expecting to be in charge. "Who are you?" she demanded. "Really?" That was the first honest question she'd ever asked me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't posture. I told her the truth. About my work, about my grandfather, about the ethics consulting I'd done quietly for years, about the reason I kept my life separate from hers. I didn't hide who I was, I said. You never cared to ask." Richard looked at Daniel. "Did you know?" Daniel shook his head slowly. "I knew she was capable," he said. "I just didn't realize how much." Margaret's face tightened. "You could have warned me." "I shouldn't have to warn you not to disrespect your son's wife," I said. That was the moment the room shifted. Not because of what I'd done, but because of what Daniel did next. "She's my family," he said, stepping forward. "And last night you made it clear you don't see her that way. That ends now." Margaret turned to him, stunned. She wasn't used to resistance, especially not from her own son. "This is bigger than you think," she said, trying one last time to regain control. Daniel didn't flinch. "No, this is exactly as big as it needs to be." The calls stopped after that. The emails didn't. Resignations, confirmations, quiet distancing from people who once lined up to sit beside her. Margaret didn't apologize. She asked for damage control. That told me everything. I didn't need her remorse. I needed the pattern to break. By the end of the day, the engagement party photos had stopped circulating. Conversations shifted. People started asking questions Margaret couldn't answer without exposing herself further. And for the first time since, marrying into that family, I was no longer the woman being talked around. I was the woman being talked about. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected. Not peaceful exactly, but honest. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm has passed and you can finally see what's been washed away. Margaret stopped calling, not because she understood, but because she no longer knew where to place me. The social calendar she once controlled unraveled quickly without the institutions that gave her authority. Invitations dried up. Luncheons were postponed. People who once praised her leadership suddenly needed space. Status, I learned, is only valuable as long as everyone agrees to believe in it. Richard retreated into silence. He never confronted me, never apologized. He simply accepted the consequences and focused on rebuilding what little independence he had left outside of Margaret's orbit. In some ways, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Evan and Lila sent a card. Not an apology, just a neutral note wishing us well. I understood the subtext. They wanted distance without confrontation. They wanted the discomfort to fade without having to name it. I let them have that. Accountability doesn't always require conversation. Sometimes it requires memory. Daniel and I didn't rush to pretend everything was fine. That mattered. For the first time, we talked without skirting the hard parts. He admitted how deeply his mother's expectations had shaped him. How often he chose silence because it felt safer than conflict. How much guilt he carried for leaving me that night. "I thought keeping the peace meant keeping everyone happy," he said one evening, sitting across from me at the same table where it had all begun. "I didn't realize it meant sacrificing you." I told him something I'd never said out loud before. "I don't need you to protect me. I need you to stand with me." He started therapy. Not as a gesture, but as a decision. He learned how to separate love from obedience, how to recognize manipulation disguised as tradition. Slowly, deliberately, he began setting boundaries that should have existed long before me. Our marriage changed after that, not dramatically, but fundamentally. Respect became something we practiced out loud, not something we assumed would survive neglect. I trusted him more because he finally trusted himself enough to say no. As for me, I returned to my life with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I didn't gain anything tangible from what happened. No public recognition, no apology tour, but I gained something far more important. I stopped shrinking. Margaret eventually asked to meet. She wanted to clear the air. I declined, not out of anger, but because the air was already clear. She had shown me exactly who she was when she thought I didn't matter. I believed her. The lesson I took from all of this wasn't about power or influence. It was about consent, about what you allow, about the danger of mistaking patience for obligation. When someone excludes you to test your worth, they're telling you how they plan to treat you going forward. When someone asks you to stay silent to keep things smooth, they're asking you to carry discomfort they refuse to face themselves. I didn't ruin anyone's life. I didn't seek revenge. I simply removed my protection from systems that never extended the same courtesy to me, and that was enough. The truth is, people like Margaret don't lose power because someone attacks them. They lose it because someone stops cooperating with the illusion that holds it together. They said, family only, as if those words had authority, as if they got to decide who mattered. What they didn't realize was that I had already decided something of my own. I would never again sit quietly in a life that required my absence to function. So if you're listening to this and you've ever been excluded, minimized, or told to wait your turn in a room where you already belonged, remember this: silence is not the same as weakness. Patience is not permission. And respect, once enforced, doesn't need to be requested again. They finally asked who I really was. By then, it no longer mattered. If this story stayed with you, it's probably because you've felt some version of it yourself. Maybe you've been excluded quietly. Maybe you've been asked to stay small to keep things comfortable. Maybe you've been told, directly or indirectly, that your presence was optional. Let this be your reminder that it never was. Respect isn't something you earn by waiting patiently. It's something you establish by deciding what you will and won't tolerate. And sometimes, the most powerful response isn't loud or dramatic. It's calm, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. If you believe silence should never be mistaken for weakness, like this video so more people hear this message, if you know someone who needs to be reminded of their worth, share this story with them. And if you've ever been underestimated, excluded, or quietly dismissed, comment below and tell us what you learned from it. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. For more true-to-life stories about boundaries, resilience, and quiet strength, subscribe to the channel and stay with us, because knowing who you are changes everything.